So, something I want to talk about today can seem a little bit silly, but I actually hope that it's kind of an interesting conversation for us to have. I'd love to see what you think down below. And that is things that I hate about books. What I mean, simply, are trends that I've seen in books that I've been reading. Mostly science fiction and fantasy, however, not exclusive to those genres whatsoever, that I think are bad. Things I'd like to see done a little bit differently. But it actually turns into a discussion about what I think makes for a good reading experience and also just like what I like to read. And it's stuff that I've been trying to think about as I try and write a novel. So the first problem that I have with many books that I read is that they do not seem to earn their length. That was a phrase that I used in a previous video. What I meant in that video, I was talking about Adrian Tchaikovsky's service model. And my entire criticism was that it felt like it was maybe 50 to 100 pages too long. That it was an interesting book. It was not necessarily a bad book, but that the book was demanding more of my time than I really felt it deserved. In that particular book's case, I thought basically the entire final act could have been cut. It would have required reworking things in the book earlier. Obviously, it's not like you could just take some scissors and cut them out of the book, but that meant that there could have been a substantial editing and revision process. This criticism is not exclusive to anything written by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I've only read 2 of his books, and so I won't even focus on him for the rest of this section. Instead, I've just noticed that there is a trend in a lot of, especially genre fiction. So when I say genre fiction, I'm mostly thinking of fantasy and science fiction, but it doesn't necessarily only have to be that. There's this trend in genre fiction where authors think that they need a certain word count in order to be able, one, to tell their story, or to build their world. And I want to talk about both of those things, but separately. There is a stereotype of fantasy books that they all have to look like this. This is my copy of Dune. It is about 900 pages, and the print isn't terribly small, but it's not big. And the idea is that if you want to write a serious fantasy or science fiction book, then maybe it needs to look like this. For some reason, this happens more in fantasy than it does in science fiction. The reason that is often given is that fantasy requires world building. And the thought goes that if you want to do a good job of world building, then you need lots of time to slowly reveal the world. You want to make it feel real, and you want to give readers a sense of immersion. And in fact, a lot of fantasy readers, I don't think are really reading for the plots. If they were reading for the plots, they would just read the same book over and over again. They're not really reading for the characters. If they were reading for the characters, then they would just read some of the same books over and over again. And that's because the plots and the characters across many of these books and series are essentially the same. I think what they're interested in then is the world. They like entering into a new and big world, and that is what draws them to the genre. So writers want to give this audience what they want, which is a big world to explore. And so the question really becomes is, do you need a really high word count or page count in order to give those readers what they want? And what I'm saying here is not that you shouldn't ever write a long fantasy or science fiction book. Instead, what I'm saying is that you should think about whether or not your book needs to be long. Because I want to say that it's actually quite possible to build an interesting and a compelling world without committing to 100,000 words or a 7-book series. So I'm going to give an example of a writer who's not often thought of as a fantasy and science fiction writer, but who I think is actually one of the best examples of at least a science fiction writer working today, and that's Kazuo Ishiguro. He wrote Never Let Me Go, Remains of the Day, but the book that I'm thinking of right now is Clara and the Sun. Clara and the Sun is an excellent piece of science fiction. It is told from the perspective of an artificial friend, an AF, Clara, as she sort of navigates this world and an illness that is besetting this girl that she's been assigned to after the girl's mother purchases her from the store. The world in Clara and the Sun is interesting. I have had long discussions with several friends about that novel, in particular about some of the background details that are going on. But Ishiguro doesn't give you a lot of the details very explicitly. Instead, what he does is he hints at things. he points out dissimilarities between our world and this world that he's writing in, and that sort of draws your attention toward those things in a way that I think makes you curious, and it makes you feel like there's a world out there that you could go and explore, and it actually leaves you hungry for more. But he does it with incredible economy. Another writer who does an excellent job of world building with only a few pages sometimes would be Ursula K. Le Guin. It's no surprise to anyone who's followed me on this channel or my bigger channel that I'm a huge Ursula K. Le Guin fan. She, I think, is one of the masters of fantasy and science fiction. Just think about the Wizard, and I often talk about the Dispossessed. Everyone wants to talk about the Dispossessed or the Left Hand of Darkness, maybe the Lay of Heaven. But let's instead think about A Wizard of Earthsea, the Earthsea books. There is a whole world there. There are continents. There's an archipelago. There are these big land masses that we only learn about later on. There are dragons with this deep history. There is some kind of other plane that you can summon spirits from. There's all sorts of standard fantasy stuff that you do feel like is real. It feels very concrete in those books. But there's also a lot of intricacy to the history. Even though it was actually written for younger readers and it has a fairly short word count, it's just fleshed out, but it didn't require a huge number of pages. So my point, I guess, in this kind of rambling section is that you can have rich world building that doesn't require a massive word count. And I have found more and more that I am preferring those books who can give me that world building experience without demanding that I commit 20 hours to the book, that aren't demanding that I commit 60 or 70 hours or 100 hours, or in some cases, close to 300 hours to reading or listening to the entire series in order to enjoy that world building. The other reason that people think they need a lot of words, though, is because they think they need it for the story they want to tell. So it's not just for the world building, but it's actually for the story itself. And the reason that they think that is the same reason that they think they need a lot of words for world building. And it's going to relate to the next theme I'm going to talk about, which is that authors are misunderstanding or over-applying the wisdom of show, don't tell. But before we talk about that, I want to say just a little bit more in virtue of reading a short economical book. You can tell a really gripping story with character progression, with multiple characters who really matter, including multiple points of view, in under 100,000 words quite easily. One of the best novels that I read last year, which is just a novel I keep thinking about so much, is The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John le Carré. I believe that it is about 65,000 words. And that book has multiple points of view to a limited degree. Obviously, it's not hopping across 7 characters or something, but it also has tragedy, it has real personal development, it explores deep themes and ideas, and it tells a really great story. And I think actually the story ended up being better because le Carré limited himself and told it in 65,000 words. Now, he has written some other longer novels too. Those happen to also be great. And it turns out he's actually able to just tell a great story. And sometimes he needs more words to do it. Sometimes he needs less. And that maybe proves that you don't always need all of those words in order to tell a really great story. But I said that maybe one of the common problems here was with this adage to show but don't tell. And I think if I were being more concrete and specific here, what I really mean is that many writers write descriptions of scenes like they are describing a movie. So if they want the reader to know that a character is angry, they will zoom in on the face and they'll describe the twitching of his lips or his eyes. They'll describe the clenching of his fist. They'll describe the way that his heart beats and maybe his ears are fleshing. They'll tell you a lot about how he looks. And that can be really effective sometimes. However, it's less effective when every scene you read is essentially an extended description of what people look like and what their faces and hands are doing. So it seems like these writers are almost allergic to saying something like, the anger swelled inside of him. They always want to describe it in physiological terms. They always want to show rather than tell. So if this is how you approach writing, your scenes inevitably get a lot longer. But it also means that you're sort of drip feeding information about the world and the lore of your book, especially if you're writing science fiction and fantasy, in a way that just, it takes forever. It takes forever to actually get any answers about things. Here's someone I don't talk about a lot here, but I've read a few of his books lately and I thought they were good, which is Michael Moorcock, and I was reading his Elric novels. Sometimes Moorcock just does an info dump. He just writes a couple of paragraphs that tell you, this is what it's like to be one of the sorcerers of Melniboné. Here is the problem with Melnibonéan politics. Here are the internal struggles of Elric. Here is a big time lapse. And here's what Elric has done in outline in the last 6 months. If you're so committed to describing every scene like it's a movie scene, you can't do any of that. And you can't even have one of those scenes where lots of time passes because you want to describe all the little minutia. I've already talked about Le Guin a bit, but I was just reading The Dispossessed yesterday, and there are moments where hours and hours pass within a paragraph in some of Le Guin's writing in The Dispossessed, and it works really effectively because she wants to tell the quick narrative of what happened in the day, but she doesn't want to do it through flashbacks necessarily or something. She just kind of says what happens, and it just works really well. And she's not showing. In that case, she's telling, but also I would say she is showing something deeper. So you often by telling a little more explicitly, you're also showing deeper things that the reader can extrapolate for himself or herself in a way that I think it makes for a better reading experience. This is like suddenly becoming like a writing advice thing, and I don't mean it like that. What I mean here, because I'm not an accomplished fiction writer by any means, I suppose that all of these thoughts are coming as like, when I am reading, this is what I would prefer to see. This is the stuff that sort of gets me excited when I read it, and this is the stuff that annoys me the most. Brandon Sanderson is a writer who almost exclusively writes movie scenes. And you see this a lot with like Wind and Truth. I mean, this book I didn't finish because I decided to give up on it. But Sanderson writes his individual scenes like they could be scenes in a TV or movie in a way that's going to make his work very easy to adapt if someone ever lets him do it. It also, I think, plays in, but the problem that you get is that you're not playing to the strengths of the written medium. Oftentimes, stories that are written or told flourish because of what they can leave unsaid or underspecified that a visual medium always has to codify immediately. Character appearance, some of the details. Think about if you're reading like Gene Wolfe. There's all this stuff in Gene Wolfe that he doesn't tell you and that you have to piece together later. If you were to adapt it into a movie or a TV show, you would simply see stuff. I'm just going to give a brief spoiler here for Book of the New Sun, so let's pause like 5 seconds. See my retention drop. Okay. When you realize that the towers that many of them live in are spaceships, if you were watching a movie of that, it would be obvious from the beginning. The sort of science fiction fantasy blending that he's doing that works so well, that is so mysterious in the books, would not be mysterious if you were watching it rather than reading it. So by choosing to write these books like they are movie scenes, you are actually hindering yourself as a writer, I would say, by not playing to the strengths of your medium. If you write your book like it's a movie, it will always be a boring movie. If you write it like it's a book, it can be more exciting than a movie. It can be more intriguing than a movie. My friends who read more like contemporary literary fiction say this is a problem there too. Admittedly, I'm not reading a lot of contemporary literary fiction. If I read contemporary stuff, it's mostly nonfiction or science fiction and fantasy. So I can't speak to those genres. Well, but I think it just kind of comes down to the fact that we're reading a generation of writers, and we are a generation of readers and writers who are primarily formed through our consumption of television and movies and video content rather than our consumption of books and essays. And so we think in those terms first when it comes to storytelling, but that's something we have to stop. But that's something I think that we need to kind of get over if we want to read and write better stories. So I actually think that the theme of this video, I'm getting to at the end, but I'm glad you stuck with me, if you stuck with me, is that modern writing conventions, modern writing advice that you'll often see online, or even you'll hear writers sharing it, does not actually necessarily always make for a great story. I feel like modern writers are always being told to give more detail, to make more vivid descriptions, to show rather than tell. But it's all actually leading to what seems like bloated books that don't actually explore the interior lives of characters very well, books that can't really explore their themes because they're too busy telling you the color of everybody's pants, and really just books that will never be able to compete with a TikTok video because they're trying to play by the same rules. And, well, we don't have to play by the same rules if we're writing a book. You can just write, and you can do more fun and playful things when you write. So, I don't know. These are unformed thoughts. I'd love to know what you think about this down below. I'm not trying to turn this into just like a gripe session about bad books. Instead, I'm trying to think like, what is it about reading a great book that I really enjoy, and why are so many of the books that I've read lately falling short of that? That's really what I'm thinking about. So if we could have that kind of conversation down below, that'd be great.